Next up is a fire starter with Mark Carney, finance advisor to the Prime Minister for COP26 and UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, and Alix, anchor of Bloomberg Television.
Mark, there's been data that says that total required investment in the energy sector is going to be $3.5 trillion a year, and a lot of that going to, say, carbon capture to decarbonize the world. Tell me how we get there.
Well, and that data is right, and that's just energy, really, it's energy infrastructure. And then there's decarbonization above and beyond that in other sectors of the economy. So we need a whole economy transition. We need to mainstream sustainable finance. We need to ultimately get to a point where every financial decision is taking climate change into account, the impact on the transition, and we actually drop the adjectives sustainable because it's just what finance professionals do.
So we're going to get to sort of the policy part of it in a second, but financial flows are really important and the private sector money is going to be key. How do we get more money from the private sector?
Well, I think what we're working to do is with the private sector to put in place the information, the tools and the markets that are needed in order to do this. The information, it starts with reporting, and it's the TCFD reporting, making it mandatory so all companies are reporting their climate risk. That's something actually Mike Bloomberg spearheaded 5 years ago. It's moving into mainstream. We want it everywhere by COP26. Secondly, on the risk side, we need the banks to look at the risks around the climate transition, which then flip to opportunities. On the opportunity side, it's really about looking for and at transition plans from all companies and backing those who are part of the solution and taking capital away from those who are part of the problem. That's how you mainstream. One last point, and I know we'll get to this, is it's very important to also help build those nature-based solution and carbon offset markets as well. That's a missing market, and it should be measured in the tens of billions a year.
How long do we have, and how long is that going to take?
How long? Well, we don't have a lot of time at the moment with the carbon budget on where we're headed. It's somewhere between 10 and 20 years, depending on how you measure it. So we need to act now, and we need to buy some time. That's part of what offsets will do for us. But also, we need to invest now. I mean, we're touch wood, we're going to be coming out of the health and economic crisis. The question is, what direction are we pointing our economies? We're going to point towards sustainable growth. Huge investment, you rightly started with that, Alix, huge numbers for investment that's capital intensive, it's job heavy. Having that information now so companies and investors can put money to work is critical.
So what role then does policy play in that? We just had an election obviously here in the US. What's the role of public policy?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple roles. One, and I wouldn't understate this first bit, is set the direction. So one of the planks of President-elect Biden's platform was the U.S. is going to move to 100% clean energy and net zero by 2050. So you set the direction. Secondly, you put in place the frameworks that are necessary, that information for investors to make the decision, and you also have credible regulatory policy. So you're showing the direction of the economy. More hydrogen, zero emission vehicles, moving towards electrifying more of the economy and moving the electricity sector and generation towards renewables. All of those things send signals to investors, provide the information as well, and gets money moving. So that's what government has to start with, the objective, fill in with the framing, and then candidly get out of the way so the private sector figures out where to go.
Has COVID helped or hurt that?
I think, if you'd asked me that question 10 months ago or 9 months ago when it started, I would have hedged like a good central banker. I would have told you both sides of it. Now the information is in, absolutely, it has helped because it's forced a couple of things. One is a social reset. We've all sort of stepped back and thought, well, what are some of our priorities? Resilience for our economy, sustainability, solidarity, all these aspects. But also strategic resets for companies because, look, there are a few companies, and they've benefited through valuations that were well positioned for the shifts that COVID's brought on. But most companies are having to change their strategies, re-optimize given what's happened. As they re-optimize, if they're in one of 126 countries now, not including the US yet, but 126 countries that have a net zero strategy, if you want to be around for the long term, you're going to have a net zero strategy. That helps because it brings forward the investment that we need to get to where we need to go.
So we have public policy, we have private money, and I just want to get your take on what central banks can do to help this or not. The Fed recently joined the Network for Greening the Financial System. They were late to the party, but is there a role for central banks here?
There's absolutely a role, which is why the Fed is joining, and I very much salute Vice Chair Quarles for that announcement. Look, there's a few things central banks can do, and as you know, Alex, central banks vary by jurisdiction. Some have more powers than others. But if you oversee the banking system, what a central bank can do is ask the banks, have you thought about where your exposures are and where your opportunities are as we transition towards net zero? That's something the Bank of England's doing. You can take it all the way to conducting climate stress tests, which 18 of the world's major central banks are doing. You can also start to think about your collateral policy over time, because ultimately, again, speaking like a central banker, Badge's dictum is you lend against good collateral. Well, in a world where you're transitioning towards net zero, good collateral is consistent with that transition. And that's something the ECB is looking at, other central banks are looking at. So there's a range of things we can do. In the end, though, we're not going to set carbon policy or climate policy. Governments are going to do that, and the private sector is going to provide the solutions.
One last question on this. Can we do it without China? How key is China going to be in all this?
China is key to virtually everything in the world, just as the United States is and the European Union is. It was very significant a few weeks ago when President Xi announced China's 2060 net zero objective. China is one of the biggest producers of electric vehicles, of wind, of solar. They have to do a lot more. They know they have to do a lot more, but they'll be essential, as all major economies will be. And that's part of what the UK has to do in partnership with Italy is for COP26 over the course of the next 12 months.